I'm Steph.
And I'm Jeff. Each week, we review a film that's streaming online.
As writers, we'll deep dive into the characters and plot to tell you if it's a good story.
Listen at your own risk. This review contains spoilers.
Now sit back,
relax,
and enjoy Stream On. Today, we'll be reviewing The Tomorrow War, streaming on Amazon Prime.
Chris Pratt saves the world from CG aliens.
That is the shortest synopsis we've ever had in the history of Stream On.
And yet, completely accurate.
Do you have anything else to say?
From fairly decently rendered CG aliens?
There you go. The white spikes, I thought they were okay. They kind of looked like a white version of the creatures from the movie Aliens with a few more appendages added.
They reminded me actually a lot of the creatures from, was it A Quiet Place?
Oh, yeah. Similar.
Yeah, but we've seen, I know we need to get into our stuff. I'm just going to finish this thought up. We've seen a lot of aliens like this. They remind me also of the Demogorgon from Stranger Things. Mm-hmm. Kind of the big spindly-legged or limbed creatures where the face splits open and stuff happens. Derivative, but fairly decently rendered aliens.
Yeah,
how's that?
Spiky, bug-like, a lot of appendages. Okay, well, The Tomorrow War is directed by Chris McKay and written by Zach Dean. It's not really based on anything, but it's in the genre of military science fiction, and it was Amazon Prime's $200 million premiere summer blockbuster film. It stars Chris Pratt as Dan Forrester, our protagonist. He's a high school biology teacher and former Green Beret who feels that he is meant to do something more with his life. Yvonne Strahovski as Colonel Murray Forrester, Dan's adult daughter, who he meets in the future. And I recognized her. I'm like, where do I recognize her from? She played Serena on Handmaid's Tale. So for anybody that watched that series, you may recognize her from that. J.K. Simmons as Dan Forrester Sr., Dan, our protagonist, estranged father, who is a Vietnam vet and has become an anti-government survivalist. Betty Gilpin as Emmy Forrester, Dan's wife and therapist for returning vets from the future. And Sam Richardson as Charlie, a draftee alongside Dan that has a PhD in environmental science and provides some sidekick comic relief in this film. So, Jeff, you chose this one. Why did you pick The Tomorrow War?
I picked this because I thought it'd be interesting to have a new release blockbuster film in our lineup. After watching it, I wanted to continue with doing the review because this is a terrible movie, but it offers a lot of insight into how not to tell a story and how not to make a movie and how not to spend $200 million.
Well, let's jump right into it. No pun intended on jump. So what did you think about the plot, the characters? Let's do an analysis.
So the plot is nonsensical, and mostly because of a lot of severe and obvious world-building problems. World-building, especially for science fiction and horror and fantasy, so the genres of fantastic, is usually very important because you have to construct a world, an arena for your characters to operate in that's not the same as the world we actually live in. So it helps when you have rules that are set up that make sense, even if they only make sense internally. This film not only breaks that, this film acknowledges that it breaks that. So the basic idea is that there's a war in the future that mankind is losing. There's only 500,000 humans left. They develop time travel, go back to the past, so our present basically, and bring people forward. They make a point that they're only bringing people forward who aren't alive in the future. So people who have died sometime between the present and, I don't know, it's like 2050 or whatever the date is in the future. Well, first, since they establish only 500,000 humans are left in the future, that should be pretty much everybody. And they make some point that like the professional military, only like 1 in 1,000 is eligible to go to the future or something like that. It's like, well, that doesn't make any sense. The human population in the future is so small, anybody alive now should pretty much be able to go to the future. The time travel thing itself, they don't explain very well. But one of the characters, the comic relief guy, does what's known as lampshading. So, are you familiar with the term lampshading?
No, but I'm intrigued.
So, lampshading is when you have a plot element that doesn't make sense. You point that out, though, in the hopes that that gets you around it. So, a good example in this movie is there is a scene where they're getting ready to go to the future to do a time jump into Miami. And one of the people is wearing a chef's outfit. So they don't give these soldiers actual uniforms. They just give them weapons and then put a vest on and send them into the future. This sidekick character says, well, why is this guy dressed like that? Never addressed. It doesn't make any sense. I think what it...
pulled him straight out of the kitchen and put him there, ready to jump into the future.
Well, I think what it is that, and this is what I think is one of the significant problems with this film, is that the creative team thought that it looked cool to have a bunch of people wearing suits and chef's outfits and jeans fighting a bunch of aliens. They never thought beyond that. But someone, I assume the writer, was like, well, I have to point this out because it's going to look, people are going to wonder what the hell's going on. But then they don't explain it.
Yeah, they tried to do this, referring to that scene where they're doing their first jump. They try to do this whole thing about time travel is like a river. Right? That is their way to sort of hand wave how they're doing the time travel. But you can tell that the writers did not think that hard about time paradoxes and how to really address that. There's this whole well, what happens to the people from 2022 that are stuck in 2050 and have jumped there once they, destroy the aliens back in 2022? They didn't really explain that. They just, time is, it's a river and it's a raft and we go one way and then we go the other way. We're just jumping back and forth. Well,
they also don't explain what happens to characters who are supposed to have died sometime between 2022 and 2050, but who then go into the future and die fighting the aliens and therefore don't live to whenever they were supposed to die between those two time points.
Right, exactly. And if there are no white spikes in the future, because I started, of course, thinking about this. If there are no white spikes in the future to drive the invention of jumping, then how would we even go get the toxin in the future, bring it back to 2022 and destroy the white spike, right? It's the whole thing doesn't really make sense, but this film is not meant to be a treatise on time travel. So I kept that in mind as I was watching it.
Well, the problem though is that when that is a core conceit of your world, of your story, you have to put at least some effort into it. You can look at, say, the Terminator series. Now, the Terminator series has gotten very convoluted as how they explain the different timelines and everything. Mm-hmm. But there's a stab at it. The idea in that is that it's creating, all this time travel is creating alternate futures, some of which Skynet still exists and so then can send Terminators back. Now, a lot of it's gobbledygook, but it shows the writers are at least trying to explain it. They actually want it to make some sort of sense.
And that's a classic way of doing it, is using alternative timelines or versions of reality.
Right. And that's that is science fiction shorthand. And it's these creators didn't even bother to do that. They could easily have said, well, this is going to create a branch timeline in which everything's different. Mm-hmm. That would, for sci-fi viewers, we're going to be like, okay, well, it's technobabble-ish, right? But it makes sense to us. And for the average non-sci-fi viewer just wants to see things blow up, they don't care. But to do this, for someone like us, who would not only like to watch and read science fiction, but write science fiction, things like this bother me. And it's especially bad when it's clear that the writers know this, because they point it out, and then they just ignore it.
The film had a lot of lazy writing. I will agree with you there, is not only did they not think about some of the world building components of how they're creating this sci-fi white spikes world, but they just do really lazy things in terms of moving our characters along in the story that make zero sense, which I can get into later. But what else did you want to say about this film in terms of the plot?
Well, actually, we can get into that right now, because I want to bring up a point that I assume that you would agree with me on. The forced drama of the Miami sequence.
Okay, let's talk about the Miami sequence because I have some things to say about that. That's one of my plot holes. Okay, so just for those that haven't seen this film, the first jump that they called time traveling jumps. And so the first jump that happens with our protagonist and sidekicks is into the future, 2050 in Miami, that has been overrun by the white spike aliens. And so they get there and they are told that they have this mission to go into a lab to collect the last remaining vials of a toxin that could kill the aliens and save humanity. So, to create more drama in this scene, I mean, having the aliens in the lab is, I guess, not enough drama for them. They have to, on top of that, have this, like, aerial bombing, and they have to bomb specifically the labs where they have the last remaining vials of the toxin that can kill the aliens for no apparent reason in my mind. Like, why would you specifically have to bomb these labs where your toxins are when these aliens are everywhere? Like, that didn't make any sense to me. What are your thoughts about that whole sequence?
It is a lazy example of a classic plot point. The classic plot point is the stopwatch, the running clock, right? You need to do X before time runs out or something bad's going to happen. Lots of movies do that. Great movies do that. Speed. Well,
Perfect example.
I was thinking, first movie came to mind for me was Star Wars, the end of Star Wars, where they have to blow up the Death Star. And there's a number of scenes where there's literally showing the planet coming into view on a big screen and a timer. So it's like that focuses the characters and forces drama, but that's done in a very understandable and organic way. Mm-hmm. This, though, because the world they set up, where humanity is basically extinct, cities like Miami, you would assume, have been abandoned for a while. Why would you bomb it when you have a team going in to get the one substance that you know can end this war? And unlike some other films where they try to make a point that, okay, our heroes are doing something where there's like a thing like the bombing going to happen, but it can't be called off because our heroes are doing something illicit. We actually just watched a movie that does this, Zack Snyder's Army of the Dead, which is a terrible movie. But the timer in that makes sense because our heroes are going into zombified Vegas and the city is going to be nuked, but they're going in illegally. So they can't stop this from happening. Mm-hmm. In this case, the bombing is going to have... The people who are doing the bombing are the ones who are fighting the war. Yeah. Why can't they just call the guys in the planes and say, hey, wait an hour to bomb this abandoned city?
So that we can rescue our vials. And then another thing I'm thinking is later on we see that their primary military headquarters is a Waterworld-esque like base in the middle of the ocean, which is, it's cool looking. I mean, you could tell they put a lot of money into like their CGI and how they constructed this thing. However, if that is your primary military base with your big fancy lab where you're going to be, keeping one of the aliens imprisoned so you can like test out your toxins, why not just have the vials stored there? Why have them in this random lab in Miami when the city is overrun by white spikes? And that also made no sense to me.
That's one of the big problems with the film. It's full of plot arcs or story arcs that are like that. They don't make any sense the moment you look at them. It is there because we want to have Chris Pratt and his buddies have to go into a dangerous area. We need the ticking clock. We need the MacGuffin, the thing they have to get that's going to change the face of the story, change the plot. If we had it done in a way that made sense, for example, the lab on the offshore platform is where the toxin is, well, then you don't get your scene in Miami.
Right.
Now, they're actually
ruins of a city.
Right. Now, a clever writer could actually have figured that out because we are told that the jump that Chris and his friends make is there's something goes wrong with it because they all appear like hundreds of feet in the air.
And they fall into the water, which I mean, was a cool scene.
Instantly, that would kill you, though.
Well,
if you're falling hundreds of feet and you slam into a pool, it's like hitting concrete.
Unless you're Chris Pratt and his buddies, or Motley Crue.
But that aside, they make it clear that there's a problem. That's where you say, well, look, we're gonna send you guys to this platform because we think that you are the ones who can use this toxin. And something goes wrong and they're teleported somewhere else. And they have to fight through and back in contact with the military and get rescued. You could do that and it would still be a thing to happen. Mm-hmm. You could still have your action scenes. You could still have your cut off heroes. You could still have some sort of timer going. The way they do it, though, is the laziest, sloppiest way possible.
Yeah, I feel like for this film, they, got a couple of A-list actors like Chris Pratt. Okay, you're going to look good on screen, going to be able to kick ass and look muscly and all that. They got a cool looking alien. They wrote the action scenes and then constructed the rest of the story around that, which is not the right way to write, but I feel like that's what happened here.
I would argue they didn't even have fully baked action scenes. They had a couple of images they had. And they really call those out. There's a scene near the end where Chris Pratt's daughter is falling towards this horde of aliens that's going to shred her. And then he jumps after her for some reason. And there's a slow motion kind of a beauty shot of all these different elements coming together. I think that's a lot of this is that they had some images that they thought were cool. An image like that, the people in civilian clothes being sent into battle and stuff like that. And it's and that's all they had. And then they kind of built out from that. And I think that's where your action scenes are well, how do we build up to these images we like?
If you're going to give the film any points, for me, the film is visually cool. They spent $200 million on it, so they should have some good visual effects. So that is neat, especially when they're, up in Siberia, trekking around and fighting an alien there. It has some neat visuals, but that's not enough to save a film that doesn't have a good enough plot.
Yeah, I do want to talk about the ending and the mini sequel that we basically get in the last 30 minutes of this movie. But one thing I wanted to bring up is you mentioned the actors. And yes, it has a very good cast, but the characters themselves are at best cliches. And one of the primary plot points is that Chris Pratt's character abandons his wife and daughter sometime between, basically when he's sometime between 2022 and 2050. We get a specific time, but I don't remember it.
Well, he basically repeats the cycle of his dad, right? His dad was his PTSD Vietnam vet and abandoned his family. And Dan, our protagonist, said he'd never do that. And then he becomes a PTSD vet from the future war and abandons his family. It basically repeats.
Right. And that's actually fine. There's nothing wrong with that. It's a little tropey, but that's okay. That's fine character background. The problem is that his daughter in the future, who is leading the resistance,
Muri,
basically thinks that he's the only person she can trust with the toxin. That makes no sense. She has an entire army of loyal people who would happily take the toxin back.
Yeah, that to me was really odd as well, given the fact that she has all these trust issues with Daddy because Daddy abandoned her. Right. Why would she all of a sudden... they were trying to force this whole redemption arc with Dan and his daughter, and then also with Dan Jr. and Dan Sr. I'm guessing whoever wrote this had abandonment issues, and they were trying to create this whole redemption arc, but it wasn't earned. Yeah. Right.
And briefly about casting, did you find Chris Pratt to be miscast? Because I did.
No, I didn't, because he's sort of your classic muscly action hero guy. It's very similar to Jurassic World and his role there.
Right, but I think he works better because of he has a good comic sense. I mean, that's where he comes from, the world of comedy. Mm-hmm. He works better with characters that have a certain comedy about them, whether it is, as you mentioned, the character from Jurassic World or, Peter Quill from the Guardians of the Galaxy movies. These are action heroes, but there's, whether it's a sardonic sense or a cynical sense or sarcastic, whatever it is that there's humor with him. This guy is completely humorless.
You're right. This was not meant to be like a Thor Ragnarok type feel of a movie.
Right, which is why I'm saying I think he is miscast. I actually like Chris Pratt. I think he is very funny. I think he's a good actor. I think, though, that to cast him in what should have been a role for someone who was more serious, you know, an actor who could pull off, or an actor who just could pull off the action hero without having to go, oh, is this guy going to be charming and amusing at some point? It's like, oh, no, it could be anybody doing that. So, yeah, that's a little aside. I know that has nothing to do with us looking at this as writers, but...
Who would you have cast? I'm just curious.
You know, I as soon as I started saying that, I knew this is a question that's going to come up.
Like Will Smith, maybe. Somebody like that.
You could do that, although... Well, he has a bit more range, too. Will Smith has actually done things, you know, he also is a guy who comes from kind of the comedy world to some degree, but he's also done some serious roles, and he has shown that he can, has some range there. So he would have been pretty good.
Vin Diesel?
Yeah, I mean, actually, Vin Diesel, Jason Statham, even Dave Bautista, any of these guys who are much more like you're just action-y heroes. Mm-hmm. I mean, you know, you don't need to make, this movie is not going to work as... like some sort of grim drama. But I think that Pratt really doesn't work in this particular role.
You don't need Joaquin Phoenix in this movie.
Although that would make for an interesting movie. Oh, man. See, now you could do this as some sort of grim meditation on war seen through like the prism of like a future alien invasion movie. Sure.
Anyway, well, I have a couple of other points I wanted to bring up about this film, but anything else that you've got that you wanted to hit on?
Not really. Now, I do have a thing, though, about the ending. But what else do you want to bring up about this movie?
So I wanted to bring up their use of Chekhov's gun. Of course, in this case, it's Chekhov's Volcano Nerd and Chekhov's C-130. So for those that don't know what Chekhov's gun is, it's basically this idea that if you hang a gun on the wall in your opening hook, at some point the gun needs to go off in the film if you're going to make a point of pointing out that there's a gun hanging on the wall. So it's not a bad literary device when it's used in a subtle way, but here it's very much, it's just clunky. So Chekhov's Volcano, this movie relies heavily on this whole thing. So in the beginning, they plant a kid that's in Dan's high school biology class that just randomly happens to be obsessed with volcanoes, almost at like, you know, spectrum level obsession. And so later on, when Dan comes back to 2022 to try to save the planet, and they need to understand about how the aliens have hit underground all these years in Russia, they are able to randomly call on this obsessive volcano kid to be able to explain this. Another example is Chekhov's C-130. So Dan Sr., the survivalist, just so happens to fly and fix specifically C-130 planes. This is critical for Dan and his crew being able to get to Russia to stop the aliens that are thawing out because of climate change in 2022. Because, of course, the government predictably won't help Dan because they have other problems. They won't help him save the world, even though Dan is the one guy that has the thing. So, which also doesn't make sense in and of itself why the government wouldn't at least entertain that, but whatever. So there's just lots of plot devices like that. Those are two examples, but I wanted to get your thoughts on how they use Chekhov's gun in this film.
Poorly. Now, I thought the C-130 thing was fine because they do establish a character who actually has a real connection to our protagonist, you know, his father. There's something of an arc there, so I didn't have as much problem with him also being this guy who, you know, owns aircraft that could be used to get to Russia.
It was a bonding thing between the Dans, so they could like heal their their straught relationship and just so happened to fight the aliens together in Russia.
Right. And so, but it was a little more organic to the story and to the primary character. The volcano thing was silly. You know, Chekhov's gun is obviously a very old standard trope. There's nothing wrong with it too. And in fact, sometimes if you have something show up that you don't use later on, it stands out. Like, why do we see this in this early scene? But when it's done in a way that is both important to the story, but the actual mechanism, in this case, this student of Dan's, is so tangential to everything else and shoehorned in, it comes across as lazy.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think that's the theme of this film, is just overall lazy writing. And I think this film tried to be two different things. It tried to be a family melodrama, and it tried to be an alien action film. And I could have done without all this family melodrama between the Dans and between Dan and Murray and the whole abandon the family plot point. Like, to me, it was just unnecessary overkill to try to add depth to a film that really didn't need depth. Like, add in more alien action scenes, maybe get a sex scene in the future with a hot soldier. What happens in the future stays in the future, something like that. You know, do something fun and cut out this family melodrama because it didn't add value to this film and it felt shoehorned in.
Yeah, for the most part, I agree. I think that you could have just had a focus on Dan Jr. and Dan Sr. And that could have been the redemption arc for both of them. That could have been the thing that bonds them together. You first would have two decent actors, obviously. You know, we've already talked about Chris Pratt, even though I think he's miscast here, but he's still a good actor. Simmons is a great actor. Mm-hmm. And the few moments he's on screen, he really stands out. First thing, because of his general screen presence. Second, because he's jacked. Man, he is in great shape. But it shows you what happens when you have personal trainers. I think we could have seen them as like your family dramas, the two of them having to bond over this with this crisis in the future, this war that they both are brought in to fight. I would have dumped everything with Dan not being happy with being a teacher. That whole thing didn't go anywhere, I thought. I didn't like anything with the daughter. The future daughter stuff did not work. It could have literally been any rando person who had just said, hey, you guys are the only survivors, so take the toxin back.
I mean, they were laying the family drama on thick, and the idea of redemption arcs, and even if you abandon your family, you can like reunite over a common enemy like the aliens. Yeah, agreed. Like, if they were going to do it, just stick with one family drama, singular plot, and move that along versus trying to have both the multi-generational with the dad and the daughter.
But you bring up the idea that you don't even need that, right?
Not in this kind of film. Right,
and that's something that we also saw with Army of the Dead, another big-budget streaming movie, which takes what should be a fairly straightforward action premise, which doesn't need a lot of layers of melodrama, but then adds in some father-daughter stuff. I guess the writers, like in both cases, think that viewers want that. Whereas if you look at some of the classic action films or sci-fi action films, like especially the 80s, I've been doing a lot of 80s movie watching lately, like Terminator. I'll bring that up again. That has no family drama, really. I mean, the first movie is very bare bones. It's like two people being followed by a machine. There's some human interaction between them because you want some of that, but there's not all this family stuff going on. And it's like these movies feel like they need to have that for some segment of the audience.
I feel like, well, to make it maybe more family friendly might be the thing, but I think an alien action film like this just does better with good alien action and maybe some romance, paint by numbers, like sex and aggression, right? It's very basic. You don't need to go in depth into a complex study of the human condition and relationship trauma. Like, that's not what these films are about. It's fun escape and looking at visually some cool things on screen.
No, agreed. So, I did want to bring up the ending, though.
Yeah, tell me your thoughts on this.
The third act almost seems like it's the sequel to the movie, because there is a very natural ending where our heroes get back from the future. The governments of the world are not going to listen to them about this toxin, and they need to go and take care of the problem themselves. End movie. Then you have your, 90-minute sequel in a year to finish that up.
Mm-hmm.
Instead, you have 30 minutes that basically takes care of that entire storyline. One of the big problems with that, though, is that the solution that they actually come up with pretty much negates the need for any future toxin, because they find this alien spaceship. Now, they start injecting the toxin into these sleep chambers, but they also wind up just loading the thing up with explosives and blowing them all up. Well, what's the whole point of the toxin?
Right.
Just show up with a bunch of C4 and blow the thing up.
Right, exactly. Basically, there's cicadas underground that you got to get above ground. They're thawing out because of climate change. And yeah, just kill them off. You don't need a toxin. Agreed.
There are two ways to use a MacGuffin. One way is that the MacGuffin is actually important to the story. The other way is that it's not important to the story because the story is really about something else. The Maltese Falcon is, probably the best example of that, where the Maltese Falcon itself is the thing all the characters are after, but ultimately, really, the story is about those characters.
Mm-hmm.
This movie, though, your MacGuffin, the toxin, is supposed to be very important. It drives a big chunk of the plot, and at the end, it's like, we could just blow shit up too because people want to see explosions. Explosions
in Siberia.
The whole thing was just an enormous mess.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. I was ready for this film to be over before they got to Siberia. And then there was a really drawn out sequence with the aliens and the fighting the alien and finally killing the aliens. It was really drawn out to me. And the movie felt about 30 to 45 minutes too long.
Agree completely.
So let's bring this home and wrap up this film. What was the best scene for you, Jeff?
I don't have one. I hated every second of this movie. There was nothing that worked for me. Now, the only caveat I will say is this. It does have some nice special effects. But with the amount of money thrown at this film, saying it has decent special effects is like going to a Starbucks and getting a cup of coffee and saying, hey, it's hot. Well, right. This must be the best coffee ever.
It's better than gas station coffee.
Oh, I wouldn't even say that. It's literally the bare minimum for a $200 million science fiction film should be that your CG looks competent. And for the most part, it does. There are even problems with that, though, because some of these scenes, I'll bring up one thing really quickly and we'll move on to what you like the best. There is a scene at the Resistance land base where it's after Miami and our heroes show up at this base, right? And there are helicopters everywhere, flying all over the place. Someone had decided to buy the, After Effects helicopter package and just wanted to jam a bunch of CG helicopters in there. It's well, the military has helicopters, so we want to make it military. So they're flying all over the place. Why? Where? Who knows? So even things like that where the actual CG is competently done, a lot of the shot composition is incompetent in this. So what did you like the best about it? So
I picked an action scene that I thought had cool CGI. It's I call it the aliens come to mama scene. So they're in this overwater base and they have imprisoned mama alien and she's waking up, and so all the other aliens are crawling and swimming towards her, and it's visually cool to see these aliens swarm the base to try to rescue their mama. And there's some good action scenes in this overwater base. So that was my favorite. Let's go to the least liked scene. I bet you have a lot you could say here.
Well, I can't come up with a specific scene since I hated all of them. But the thing about this film that really was the most insulting was actually not kind of the stereotypical plot or the weak characters, because there are films that have those elements that I actually enjoy. The world building was so insultingly bad in this movie, to the point that the writers are pointing out how bad it is and then not fixing it. That bugged me. As a writer, when I write, I try to have a coherent world that I set up. Even for a short story, I sit back and try to figure out how everything works, even if it doesn't show up on the page. So I know how it works. Watching this, it's like they clearly didn't care. And that I find that to be a waste of my time and a shocking waste of money.
$200 million for this gem. For me, it was just the family melodrama. I was bored by it. I wasn't invested enough in the characters to care. I would have rather have them spent that time on some good action scenes or throw in some very, generic romance. Something would, besides the family melodrama, would have helped. Okay, well, let's do our final rating.
Okay, so on a scale of 0 to 5 time-traveling pandas, what are you going to give whatever movie this is?
I give it 2.5. It's mediocre. Paint by numbers, summer blockbuster, sci-fi. The aliens are cool to look at. There's some decent CGI. It's watchable if you don't care about world building or take things too seriously in terms of the characters. If you just want to escape for a little bit of time, watch people kick alien butt, see some visually cool scenes, then watch it. If the plot holes and the world building weaknesses are going to bother you, then skip it. So I kind of went middle of the road. I think some people will enjoy it as an escape film. I think others will really be bothered by it. So it just depends on what you're in the mood for. What about you, Jeff?
Well, my pandas were not in the mood for this movie because there's 0 of them watching this thing.
Wow.
Part of it, I will say, is that I've definitely, even in the last year, right, seen movies that are on some objective level worse. Worse acting, a worse script, although that would be very hard to top because this movie's terrible on that. The effects aren't as good, whatever. But I do rate movies to some degree on a scale. And then if you have a talented cast and a lot of resources that you're throwing at your film, I expect something more than I would for something that has like 0 budget and no name actors and is someone shooting something, in their backyard.
Yeah, this film underscores the problems of weak screenwriting, because that's what really was this film's downfall, is it had very poor screenwriting and no amount of CGI, visuals, A-list actors can really fix that. Okay, Jeff. Well, what do we have coming up next week?
So next week, we're going to be checking out Triangle, currently on Tubi. Stream On is a production of Steph and Jeff Wrights Media. Reproduction without written consent is prohibited. All rights reserved. 2021.